Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. We're holding to let folks jump in, but I just wanted to give a brief introduction to the webinar series itself. Again, my name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for NLC, and I'm going to share just a brief welcome just to the network, introduce our speaker, and then we'll just go through some housekeeping rules as we work through the presentation today. So a brief overview of the network. We launched in 2011, and the Network for Landscape Conservation is a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation. We really strive to connect people to ideas and innovation and to each other. And we really consider the network a community as much as an organization, a community that's connected by a shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. And we strive to create opportunities for this community to learn together. And so for this reason, we've continued this webinar series throughout the fall. So today we have some great speakers, but there has been a slight change in our speakers that I wanted to make you all aware of. So Mallory Martin, who's the SECAS coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is unfortunately not able to join us. But today we have Hilary Morris, who's the Blueprint User Support and Communications for SECAS and is an employee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she'll be giving the presentation today. She's based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she coordinates and communicates for SECAS. That involves everything from website management to the newsletter and documenting blueprint methods. And also, in addition, we have Shawn Johnson, who's the Managing Director and at the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at the University of Montana. And he's worked with SECAS on several projects that you'll hear about today, and is also the network co-chair. So he'll be participating during the Q&A portion of this webinar. A few logistics before I hand it off to Hilary. As we listen to the presenters today, please submit your questions in the chat and the Q&A function on Zoom. And once the presenter is done, we'll have the remaining time around 15 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. So with that, I will hand it off to Hilary to start the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kat. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. Mallory's really sorry you couldn't make it, but I'll hold down the fort. So I'll be talking today about the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS, as we affectionately call it, and our primary product, the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. SECAS is a regional conservation initiative that spans 15 states of the Southeast and Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. In the open ocean, we do work along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast of Florida out to the end of US waters as well. SECAS was started in 2011 by the states of the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or SEAFWA, as well as the federal agencies who are part of the Southeast Natural Resource Leaders Group. Back in 2020, we added representatives from 3 nonprofit organizations as well: the Nature Conservancy, the Open Space Institute, and the Southern Group of State Foresters. So each of these organizations designates a point of contact who participates in SECAS decision-making. Now, why SECAS? I'm going to gloss over a lot of this slide because, of all people, I don't think I need to sell the Network for Landscape Conservation on the need for landscape conservation approaches, but SECAS did emerge out of the recognition that I feel I can safely assume you all share, that the conservation challenges that we're facing are just too big for any one organization to address alone. And if we want to sustain the resources that we care about into a changing future, we're going to need to work together on shared priorities and shared actions. But to get into a little bit more why SECAS specifically originated, we started right when the LCCs, or the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, were starting to gain traction as these independent self-directed partnerships. And many of the partners participating in LCCs wanted to ensure that the work of the LCCs didn't just stop at these sub-regional boundaries that you see on this map, but seamed together and added up to something bigger, to regional products and regional tools that better aligned with the scale at which those partners were making decisions. And so as part of that, SECAS really became the forum for these LCCs in the Southeast and Caribbean to work together, to coordinate, to align their efforts. And even though there have obviously been a lot of changes to the LCC network in the last few years, which I won't really get into today, I still think this speaks to the niche of SECAS, that as organizations and partnerships have increasingly answered that call to landscape conservation, it's getting harder to figure out how all those partnerships and all those tools fit together, what it all adds up to at the landscape scale. And that's really what SECAS is trying to do. And as we do that, one of our guiding principles has always been to honor agencies' differing responsibilities and authorities. And I think that emphasis has helped build trust with a lot of our partners and helped us achieve kind of a lighter level of governance than we might otherwise need. So what does SECAS do? In a nutshell, we set a bold vision and an ambitious goal for what we want the conservation future of our region to look like. We design a blueprint for action, a spatial plan for where we're going to work to make that vision and goal a reality. And then we really do whatever we can to clear barriers to cross-state and cross-boundary collaboration. The SECAS vision is a connected network of lands and waters that supports thriving fish and wildlife populations and improved quality of life for people. And to make that vision a little bit more actionable, we also have this overarching goal for what we're trying to achieve. And that's a 10% or greater improvement in the health, function, and connectivity of southeastern ecosystems by the year 2060. The idea here is that this goal is ambitious and it's going to challenge us, but that it's achievable as well. And that goal is pretty long-term. So to determine whether we're on track, we do break it down into these interim milestones. A 1% improvement every 4 years in that ecosystem health, function, and connectivity, as well as a corresponding increase in conservation actions within the blueprint, which I'll get into in a few minutes. To measure our progress toward achieving that goal, we do put out an annual SECAS Goal report, which essentially takes the most recent 3 to 6 years of data from existing Southeast-wide monitoring programs and looks at trends in a series of indicators. So this is an excerpt from a figure in the report. It's just showing the various indicators that we're measuring to look at progress toward the goal, and they're grouped by those health, function, and connectivity components. So the health indicators, these are all about the condition of species and ecosystems. The function is all about the benefits that those species and ecosystems provide to people. And then connectivity is more about the ability of species and ecosystems to move over time, both on the land and in the water. So these little number lines where each of these indicators is plotted, this is just showing which indicators are on track to meet the goal. Those are shown in green. Which ones are off track to meet the goal, and those are shown in red. Yellow is somewhere in between. So the idea here, the goal of the goal report, if you will, is really to kickstart tough conversations about trade-offs. What is all of our collective work as a conservation community adding up to? What can we kind of get away with saying, keep up the good work, you're on a good track? And where do we need to look at indicators that are falling through the cracks and maybe think about where we could make more of a concerted effort to bring those up to scratch? So that's the vision and the goal. That brings us to the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, which is the primary product of SECAS. This is a map, a living spatial plan that identifies important areas for conservation and restoration across the SECAS geography. So high conservation value areas shown in dark blue, those are the ones that are most important for ecosystem health, function, and connectivity. There's that concept again. And then the lighter blue, medium conservation value, depicts areas that might need a little bit more restoration, a little bit more love, but they're still super important for buffering and connecting those high value areas. So the map we're looking at here, this is version 2020 of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. It's our current version and it just came out last fall. We are just a few weeks away from releasing a new version, Blueprint 2021. So stay tuned for that. A couple things I like to encourage people to keep in mind as they explore the blueprint, especially if they're looking at it for the first time. It's intended to identify areas for a range of different conservation actions, and that does include protection, but it's not just limited to protection. These are places where you might want to do management actions or economic incentives or work with private landowners. The blueprint is definitely a work in progress. I mentioned that revision cycle, how we're moving to a new version next year. We're always looking for new data, input from new partners, and better information about on-the-ground conditions. So as part of that, we publish a list of known issues every year along with the blueprint that documents where is the blueprint falling short, what do we want it to do better, and we release that not just for transparency, but also so that we can use that to prioritize future improvements to the blueprint. So we fully acknowledge that it's not perfect, we're just working to make it better and better over time. And then lastly, it's intended to provide a regional perspective that can be used in combination with local data and knowledge. So when I'm talking to people about the blueprint, I'm not saying drop what you're doing, use the blueprint instead, it's so much better. The blueprint is not supposed to be one plan to rule them all. It's totally intended to be complementary to the data and information and knowledge that people already use and trust. It's just to give that regional lens. So now I want to take a look under the hood of the Southeast Blueprint and show how it fits together and how it's made. Essentially what we're doing is we're stitching together different sub-regional plans, almost like pieces of a puzzle or squares in a quilt. And with a set of consistent rules, we translate the priorities from these underlying plans into the blue map that you saw a couple of slides ago. So each unique color on this map represents a different sub-regional input to the blueprint. And then the hatched areas are places where there's overlap between more than one plan, and we're using more than one plan to give the blue priorities in the blueprint. So that's how the blueprint's working now. You might recognize some subregions that kind of look like they might match LCC boundaries if you were familiar with LCCs. And that's because a lot of these subregional planning products that we're using in the blueprint got their start with the LCCs. Now I want to tell you how we're moving toward a new approach next year, because we are really overhauling how we make the Southeast Blueprint and taking a massive leap forward in the consistency of the underlying methods and the indicators. So this is how the blueprint's going to be made next year in 2022. We're going from 6 different inputs to the blueprint over this kind of core chunk of the SECAS geography down to just 1. And we're excited about this for a couple of reasons. It's going to make the blueprint a lot more relevant to regional decisions, because often people will want to know that the data in North Carolina and the data in Texas are consistent, they're compatible, it's apples to apples, versus, oh, the priorities in Central North Carolina are coming from the South Atlantic blueprint, and it had this set of indicators and methods, and it's at this resolution. And Texas is from the Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, which was made a different way. So we know that that's a barrier, and that's something that we're actively working on improving next year. I also think it's going to create a lot of new opportunities for people to participate in the blueprint, help develop it, get their fingerprint on the plan, whether that's by reviewing draft blueprint priorities or participating in an indicator development team. We're really enthused about all of the new opportunities to broaden the folks who are involved in making this plan. So now that we better understand what the blueprint is, how it's being made, I want to talk about how it's being used. And this is what I get most excited about, because this is where my role of user support comes in. So the job of user support is really to work with people closely in the conservation community to answer their questions about the blueprint and how it works, to help them apply the blueprint to their work, whether that's by informing a conservation decision or strengthening a grant proposal, and then take everything that we learn by working with that person about what the blueprint's doing well, what it's not doing well, and feed that back into that revision cycle I mentioned. So the blueprint keeps getting better and better over time in a way that's driven by the needs of people who are actually using it. So far, more than 250 people from over 100 different organizations have used or are in the process of using the blueprint in their work. And you can see that that spans a whole lot of different types of organizations in different sectors. We really want the blueprint to be a tool for the whole conservation community. So I will mention, I just talked a lot about how many people are using the blueprint and who's using the blueprint. And the reason that we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about that is not because it's necessarily important for its own sake or because it makes us feel useful and good about ourselves as staff, but because as people use the blueprint, we're really moving the needle for conservation. And this is kind of our logic model or our flow chart for how we think about that. So as individuals and organizations use the blueprint to allocate their existing resources more efficiently, or to bring in new resources that might not have otherwise come to our region, that's making progress on the SECAS vision and the SECAS goal. Like I said earlier, the blueprint really is our spatial strategy for how we're going to get to that impact box at the end, thriving fish and wildlife populations and improved quality of life for people. And we can measure each step in this process using the metrics that are shown at the bottom of the slide. So with that context, I'm going to jump into examples of how people are using the blueprint. This is my favorite thing to talk about. I obviously can't share every way that the blueprint's being used, but I've picked a few that I hope you all will find interesting and compelling. So one of the more exciting blueprint use cases that we've worked on in the last few years has been through the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And they wanted to update their conservation vision for the state of South Carolina, which is really their map of land and water conservation priorities in the state. They wanted to anchor their updated vision on the blueprint, and we worked with them to help them find their piece of the Southeast Blueprint, find the part of it that best aligns with their mission, which in their case, they were looking for kind of big contiguous chunks of priority, large focus areas. Once they updated their conservation vision, TNC was able to then use it, and with it the blueprint, to advocate for the reauthorization of an important funding source and state agency called the South Carolina Conservation Bank. And that reauthorization was a little bit up in the air. There were some skeptical folks on the legislature, and the blueprint in particular really helped them communicate how the conservation community has come together around shared priorities, how they are implementing projects strategically, and how having a good, solid, rigorous science-based plan based on good data can help ensure that projects get targeted in a really transparent and replicable way. And so once the Conservation Bank did successfully get reauthorized, which was very exciting, the Conservation Bank then embarked on its own prioritization process. And we were super excited that they used the blueprint as one of their ecological conservation priorities. And I will highlight that they used a lot of other great data too. And that's part of what I was saying about how the blueprint is intended to be used in combination with other data sets. So the blueprint was in there along with wild and scenic rivers and historic battlefields and important habitat for at-risk species and climate resilience and all sorts of stuff. But the blueprint was one of those ingredients in the prioritization. So now that the Conservation Bank is reauthorized and it has its own prioritization, partners are starting to apply for funding from the Conservation Bank to get their projects done on the ground. And one example of this that we helped with was through, again, the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And our blueprint user in this case was David Bishop. And he used the blueprint to strengthen an application to the Conservation Bank to help protect a really exciting parcel called the Groton Plantation. And this was the largest private conservation easement in South Carolina history. There's a lot of really cool stuff about this tract. Protecting it creates a corridor that connects across the South Carolina and Georgia border, in which wildlife can roam for 50 miles without ever leaving protected lands. And it has a lot of amazing species values, a huge population of red-cockaded woodpeckers, gopher tortoises, all sorts of great stuff. So I could go on and on about the virtues of this parcel. But what we were really excited about is that David used the blueprint to strengthen his proposal to the South Carolina Conservation Bank. And when I followed up with him just to hear, how did this grant turn out? We do track our blueprint uses and try to keep a hold of the outcomes and how things turned out. And he totally unprompted gave me this great testimonial and said that the South Carolina Conservation Bank called out the application for the Groton project as one of the best they've ever seen, which I think is at least partly the result of your data and document. He's referring to the analysis that we did of the blueprint priorities and the underlying indicators in the Groton Plantation. And he says, I think it, meaning user support, is a very valuable service and absolutely helped us get money. So in this case, I want to be really careful not to take credit for the amazing work of TNC and a whole host of partners that made this happen. The blueprint was in a supporting role here, but I do think this quote from David does really show the value that users see in the blueprint and the underlying data and why user support is important. One place where the blueprint is gaining increasing traction is informing local planning efforts by counties and municipalities. So this is one example that we've worked on with the Catawba Council of Government, who covers a 10-county region of upstate South Carolina, and they support cities and towns and counties as they do their local planning. So this was a comprehensive plan for the town of Fort Mill, where they used the blueprint to inform the identification of these natural resource priority areas. So these priority areas in the comprehensive plan will help guide things like where mitigation of development impacts occurs, how they do their land use planning, where they might want to conserve key habitat or increase recreational opportunities for their residents. But not only did they identify these priority areas using the blueprint, they also used the blueprint to recommend some actions that might be appropriate to undertake in these priority areas. Where might they do riparian buffer restoration or work on a corridor or plant Piedmont prairie plants and pollinators or remove invasive species and those sorts of things. So we have a lot of work to do in this space. We definitely don't have this one cracked yet, but we're very excited about the potential to continue informing the way that cities and towns grow with an eye toward conservation. Our region is urbanizing so rapidly, and I think that this is going to be an exciting new frontier. The last use case I'll get into in any depth, I wanted to talk about how the blueprint is informing the special resource study of the Ocmulgee River corridor in Georgia. This is a study that was commissioned by Congress to evaluate the river corridor and whether it rises to the level of being included as a unit of the National Park Service system. So we've been working with the National Park Service team that's leading this study. They use the blueprint to identify and assess priority resources within the corridor. They have kind of a discrete set of criteria that they have to use to evaluate how significant particular resources are. They also are considering looking at the corridor a little bit more holistically as a wildlife corridor instead of just going resource by resource through it. This would be kind of a new frontier for the Park Service, and they might be using the blueprint in that approach. At the same time, we've been working with a nonprofit organization on the study, the National Park Conservation Association. They were very interested in seeing a broad landscape scale conception of the study area that doesn't just begin and end at the Ocmulgee River floodplain itself, but also includes a lot of the high priority uplands on either side of the river. And one other thing I'll mention in this general area, there is another study going on at the same time at Robins Air Force Base, and they are doing a sustainability plan that looks at more or less the impacts that the base has on the community and that the community has on the base and how to make those things more complementary. And one of the chapters in that plan is going to be focused on environmental and cultural resources. We're participating in that process and looking to, as much as we can, build consistency between this National Park Service study and this DoD study that are really looking at the same general area. We're excited for the blueprint to play a potential role in that study as well. Now, I won't get into these in any detail just because I've already talked a lot about blueprint uses, but I told you I really like to talk about this stuff. So just to hit a few more highlights, the blueprint has been incorporated into a few state wildlife action plans and some forest action plans. And we hope to make more progress on that in the future. Several longleaf local implementation teams have used the blueprint to identify their conservation and restoration priorities and to promote data compatibility across the entire longleaf range. The blueprint's been used to bring in funds for prescribed fire and other management actions to benefit at-risk species. Increasingly, the U.S. Forest Service in the Southeast region has been relying on the blueprint to inform their land and water conservation fund priorities, and we've supported Sumter National Forest, specifically in strengthening their applications for land and water conservation fund money. And then lastly, we have been working with a great local partnership, the Upper Waccamaw Task Force in coastal South Carolina, to develop a land protection strategy at a couple of different scales, kind of a broad scale and a really specific parcel level scale. I want to wrap up talking about future directions for SECAS and how we continue to evolve as an organization. We just wrapped up over the last 2 years overarching assessment of SECAS as a partnership and how we provide value to our partners. And Shawn Johnson was the project lead for this project. So I might ask him to fill in any gaps that I miss at the end. But one of the key findings of this project was that SECAS is most effective in 2 ways: as a forum for collaboration and as a hub for decision support and science delivery. And from the project, there were a number of short-term, high-priority recommendations that I'll talk about. Most of those we've already implemented, one of which was to formalize SECAS governance by making the executive level steering committee a permanent committee of CAFWA. And interestingly, both the Midwest and the Northeast equivalents, the MAFWA and NEAFWA, have adopted that same approach. A couple of the other recommendations that we've implemented were to develop a statement of shared purpose and to make the SECAS coordinator position a permanent full-time role and get a commitment to sustained investment in other SECAS staff positions, which we do now have from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast region. And since I just talked a little bit about governance, I wanted to throw this diagram up on the screen and just show you all how it fits together. That executive level steering committee that I just mentioned is at the top. That's made up of 5 state directors from the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and a representative from that Southeast Natural Resource Leaders Group, who in our case is the regional director for the Southeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Then we have the SECAS coordinator, that's Mallory, and a whole bunch of staff that are provided through the Fish and Wildlife Service. Technical and coordination capacity, we rely pretty heavily on those points of contact that I mentioned earlier, representatives from CFWA states, those SNRLIG federal agencies, and those 3 nonprofits. There are a bunch of partnerships working in the Southeast that we coordinate with. We coordinate particularly closely with the CFWA Wildlife Diversity Committee and the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. We don't really have a formal partnership committee or anything like that. We just sort of informally nurture these relationships, often serve on each other's technical teams. And we do have a monthly call of what we call the SECAS lead coordination team, where representatives from lots of these partnerships are able to participate. And beyond this sort of formal structure that this outlines, there are a lot of other opportunities for people to participate in SECAS. Anyone in the conservation community who wants to get involved, whether that's pretty passive and they just want to keep an eye on the newsletter, or they want to more actively participate by using the blueprint, providing feedback, reviewing indicators, coming to a workshop, and those sorts of things. So getting back to the SECAS Futures project, one of the recommendations that we're just starting to implement is conducting a social network analysis. And once again, Shawn Johnson is our project lead for that. So the goal of that social network analysis is really to create a partnership atlas and examine how SECAS relates to other conservation partnerships working in our region, looking for gaps, looking for places where SECAS can be complementary or might even conflict. I like to think of this as almost the social or organizational counterpoint to the blueprint. If the blueprint's sort of mapping our ecological landscape, the social network analysis will map the partnership landscape and look at where SECAS can play a role. And then the last thing I want to mention here is that SECAS just wrapped up a symposium at the CFWA annual meeting that looked at the role SECAS might play in America the Beautiful and our goal to conserve 30% of the nation's lands and waters by the year 2030. One takeaway from that symposium and from the Futures Project, I think, is really that the work SECAS is doing and the approach that we're using is advancing the goals of America the Beautiful. And a few key themes that emerged from this symposium that I'll mention. One was just to really seize the momentum of this America the Beautiful initiative. It's high profile, it's coming straight from the top. Let's take full advantage of this opportunity. The second was to advance America the Beautiful through existing approaches as much as possible. Try not to create a bunch of new stuff and risk reinventing the wheel. Third was to focus more on conservation outcomes and less about the accounting of how we measure 30%. If we lead with the outcomes, the numbers will come. We don't want that to be a barrier. And then the last theme I'll mention was to support locally led conservation efforts that add up to regional accomplishment. And I think that's really a great niche for SECAS, because as this large landscape partnership, we're not necessarily going to be running around restoring watersheds through on the ground projects, but can we work with those watershed partnerships and make sure that those projects are aligned and are fitting together in a way that they add up to something bigger and to a real measurable outcome instead of just a series of discrete projects. So I think that really speaks to the role that SECAS can play in advancing this work. So we'll bring these recommendations forward to the steering committee at a meeting that we hope to host in December. And then we'll be working into the new year on distilling some overarching recommendations to tackle in 2022, in addition to this big new blueprint approach. And we'll be bringing those to the points of contact. So I want to pause here and just give Shawn the opportunity to chime in if there's anything you wanted to add about SECAS Futures or the social network analysis that I might have missed.
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation, Hilary. Really fantastic. Always impressive to see and hear how much SECAS is doing and your role in supporting all of it. Just from my perspective, so hi everyone, it's good to see all of you here. Thanks for making the time, seeing some familiar names in the attendee list too. It's great to see so many people who have a connection to the LCCs or landscape scale conservation work, or some element of this in informing and supporting your own work. As a member of the Network for Landscape Conservation and through my work at the university, I was invited to help SECAS just take a look at how are they adding value through the SECAS Futures project? What are those ingredients for success? And it was funny when I started this because I feel naive asking this now, but one of the first questions I asked was, well, what is SECAS? Is it a partnership or is it this blueprint? And the answer is it's both, right? You've got this network of people who have come together to think about landscape scale conservation opportunity. And this partnership provides that space to explore different dimensions of that conversation, including who's doing what and where, and how does this really look when you're thinking about habitat needs and conservation issues in South Carolina versus another part of the Southeast. And just to bring those voices, those questions, those concerns forward, and to organize them in some sort of way has been super beneficial to the region. And in looking at that, what I think Mallory calls the messiest slide in the world, that governance structure slide, it's connecting all of those different pieces together. Yeah, thanks, Hilary. And really trying to inform collective action. And certainly this is at the level of how can you coordinate at that kind of executive level. But the nice part of this story is that those higher level conversations have informed development and adaptation and evolution of the blueprint, and they've connected down to these use cases. And to Hilary's point, I think that's is one of the most exciting things that SECAS has been able to foster and support is moving from kind of that historical top-down conservation priority setting of saying we're going to direct activity to saying, let's use data to inform conversations that are happening in multiple places through multiple partners around different priorities, around different issues, and really transforming, like I was saying, top-down directed to more data supported and empowered communities who are trying to make decisions that work best for their particular context or place. So I think that's fantastic. Our job in the SECAS Futures project was to identify those areas of value, which are in that report, through a couple of different things. We conducted interviews with leadership voices from across the region. There were 22 interviews with SECAS points of contact, state and federal agency leaders, nonprofits, conservation organizations, and others. We did a literature review, just a summary of what's really best practice in landscape scale conservation, especially from that governance perspective. We didn't want governance to be the overarching drive or consideration for what our findings were. We wanted to really follow this adage that form or governance should follow function most of the time. But if you think about governance as being supportive of this broader suite of activities and priorities, it's really something that's embedded in and woven within the fabric of the partnership itself. And so we thought about things like the steering committee and staffing and capacity and support and roles and responsibility and what makes sense at different scales of activity. And you're seeing through Hilary's presentation here how a lot of that's playing out in real time and how they're continuing to use both that idea of being a forum and being a place for decision support is really helping to continue to foster the kind of activities, the kind of products, the kinds of conversations, the kind of decisions that are helping the Southeast collectively move towards that longer term goal. One of the things that seemed to be a missing piece around just understanding how these pieces are woven together is a more in-depth analysis of the social infrastructure. And I love that analogy, Hilary. I've used it myself about saying, can we create a social blueprint that would be a nice corollary to the blueprint that's really looking at those habitat priority areas or those ecological priority areas? I think that we can. We're thinking right now about how best to think through different themes, different ways in which people connect, different strength of ties between people. So how are they connecting? How often, on what issues and where, so that we can facilitate effective communication and coordination, recognizing that so much of what happens at the large landscape scale are identifying those things that no one party can do on their own that are really those intersection points. And so we know that in order to leverage those intersection points, we really need to have a better understanding of what those different nodes in the network look like, how they're currently connected, where there might be gaps in either knowledge, understanding, or actual relationships, and then using that knowledge to help inform future steps for both SECAS as a forum and SECAS as a decision support hub. So I'll stop there, and it looks like there are a couple of questions coming into the Q&A. Glad to answer any questions that people want to bring forward, but I'll just pause and see, Hilary, if there's anything that you wanted to add here just in summary before we open it back up to questions.
Yeah, I'm just going to put this final slide on so that you all know where to go for more information. The SECAS website is secassoutheast.org. Definitely a lot of info there about the history of SECAS, the blueprint, the data sets that go into it, the goal, all of that good stuff. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter using the footer on any page of the website. And then here's contact information for our coordinator, Mallory Martin, who, as I said, was really sorry not to be able to make it today, but I'm sure he'd love to hear from anyone with questions, and as would I. So there's my email as well. Yeah, with that, I think that's all I had, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for the great presentation. And Shawn, thank you for chiming in. I really appreciate the additions. So we'll get to some questions that have been coming in, and please feel free to continue to use the chat as we go along. So one question that has come in from an audience member is kind of looking at the blueprint itself. Has SECAS thought about providing dynamic web applications through ArcGIS Online for folks to use?
Yeah, we do provide web map services for the blueprint and all the indicators. That data is parked on Sciencebase, the USGS platform, and those web map services can be imported into any web mapper of your choice, including AGOL. The platform that we've been using up until now for sort of sharing our spatial data, if someone wants kind of an online free alternative to a desktop GIS application, so far we've been using the conservation planning atlases, but are exploring some other platforms for doing that as well through GeoPlatform. That might be more detailed than you wanted, but if you're an AGOL user, maybe that would be interesting to you. But yeah, we definitely have web map services that can be imported into the viewer of your choice. We also have a more, we almost think of it as Google Maps for the blueprint level of viewer, where you can just click around and explore the blueprint priorities and look at, in some subregions, the indicators that are driving those priorities. So that really allows you to answer the priority for what question, but we get a lot for user support. I see this is blue. Why? What data is driving that? What's it important for? And so that is going to be functionality that will be moving out of beta. We're calling that the beta viewer for the Southeast Blueprint right now, but that will become fully functional, where you'll be able to see the underlying data across the whole Southeast for that 2022 blueprint that I highlighted.
Great, thank you. And another question that came in, so we have the map in front of us of partnerships that are included in this, and thank you for providing the distinction between all the different plans that kind of came together to provide that foundation, and now we're shifting. Now you guys are shifting. The one question that has come up is, are there other states that could be included in the 2022 blueprint, or has this been the priority areas been what you had put on your slide, such as Pennsylvania or others?
Sure. Yeah, I saw that question in the chat. So I think the spatial extent of SECAS and the geography where we work really reflects the partners that are participating in the governance. So it was started by CIAFWA, so it covers the geography of CIAFWA. But, so I don't see the extent of the blueprint changing, that the Southeast blueprint would all of a sudden include Pennsylvania, because we don't have partner participation from the state of Pennsylvania. But I do want to make that important clarification that blueprint-like things are happening all over the country, and Nature's Network is one that is in a great position and is really far along. So in fact, the priorities from West Virginia and Virginia, and I might actually go back to that crazy quilt blueprint slide just to show you, because I can be a little bit of a visual thinker. So this in the orange here, from West Virginia and Virginia, those data are coming from Nature's Network. And Nature's Network is kind of analogous to the Southeast Blueprint, but it covers the whole Northeast United States. Again, it's tracking with the NEAFWA geography. So Nature's Network is doing spatial planning for Pennsylvania, and we're just sort of clipping the blueprint down to the Southeast as defined by CIAFWA, but certainly there's spatial planning going on in Pennsylvania. And the Midwest Landscape Initiative is really starting to get rolling on spatial planning in the Midwest. Then there's that crucial habitat assessment tool. We've just pulled the 2 states from the chat that overlapped with the SECAS geography, Texas and Oklahoma, but That effort is led by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or WAFWA, and they are doing spatial planning for all of those states. That's at a different scale. The origin of the crucial habitat assessment tool is a little bit more geared toward like siting energy projects. So it's not quite as granular as the Southeast Blueprint. It's more at these big hexes, but that's still a really valuable product. And so the goal is definitely not for the spatial planning to stop at the Southeast, but I think the Southeast Blueprint will probably continue to cover this specific geography into the future.
That's great. And thank you so much for bringing up the slide. I'm a visual person too, so that's very helpful. So we have one other question that's come in. So what is the relationship between the blueprint and the SWAPs? And yeah, if you could clarify that.
Sure. Yeah, so several individual states have incorporated the blueprint into their SWAPs, their state wildlife action plans, sometimes to inform the identification of spatial conservation opportunity areas, or COAs. And that's something that we'd certainly like to do a lot more of, is work with more states to get the blueprint included in the SWAPs. I think there's a major desire for better consistency and coordination across SWAPs. A SWAP is specifically for a particular state, but the work that an individual state is doing, as we all know, is certainly influencing species and resources and ecosystems that do cut across those jurisdictional boundaries. So yeah, the blueprint is different from the SWAPs. The blueprint is included in some of the SWAPs, but one thing that I will highlight is SECAS has been supporting an effort through the SEAFWA Wildlife Diversity Committee to better coordinate SWAPs and come up with some common themes and some regional approaches. We just finished a survey of all the SWAP coordinators in the Southeast and have some great lessons learned. In fact, I think that final report of that survey will be going out in our November newsletter at the end of the month. But there's a little blog sort of giving a sneak peek of those results in our October newsletter last month. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
No, I think that's great. And yeah, working more with states, it's on that radar and trying to figure out how to integrate that work together. We had one other question come in. Has SECAS been used to prioritize conservation land for source water and drinking water protection?
I'm trying to think of a specific example. It's definitely been used on lots of aquatics issues. I'm not sure if there's any specific examples about source water and drinking water protection, but I think that does speak to that nexus of that ecosystem function that is captured in the goal report, and trying to make sure that we're capturing the value that ecosystems and species provide to people. I think that's something the blueprint definitely could help with if there was someone interested in using the blueprint in that way. And we do certainly have we hope to have indicators in this new Southeast Blueprint approach next year that will really capture water quality.
That sounds great. Thank you. And a quick question kind of following up on that train of thought. Do you see the indicators, as you're updating it, how often is it updated is a simple question, but then, when those indicators are updated, how does that translate to on the ground, and how are you working with partners to say, hey, it's been updated. Can you look at your landscape and see if there's been adjustments? How does that work?
So the revision cycle for the Southeast Blueprint itself, with this approach that I'm showing on this slide, has been annual. So every fall, we will incorporate any improvements that have been made to these underlying plans and stitch everything back together so that it's always reflecting the latest spatial planning products for each subregion. Moving into this 2022 blueprint approach, it'll be the first time that we've ever done it. So certainly there will be a regular revision cycle, whether it will continue to be annual, or maybe it might be every 2 years or something like that. I don't think we really know yet. I think annual, at least for the near future, is probably a safe bet, because I know as part of this, we think of this process as what we call lean startup, which is sort of an approach that we've stolen from the tech world. And the idea is that you, rather than trying to get it right the first time and spending 10 years developing the perfect plan and then unveiling it only to realize that all the decisions that you wanted the plan to help inform are now gone and people have sort of lost their enthusiasm. We really try to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good and just focus on making it better and better. But but keeping that ball rolling, all in the service of learning and not necessarily perfection. So as part of that, we have to let go of stuff that we really want to squeeze in a particular year. And that keeps us all extremely motivated to keep on that regular revision cycle, because we're like, oh, I really want to get this new data in there next year. So I would assume we would be going annually, or at least close to annually, at least for the next few years, because we've got major improvements we want to make in the Caribbean and other areas. So, but it's been annual up till now, and I can promise that we will be regularly revising.
Yeah. And so when that transition happens, then you kind of work and evaluate, and,
right.
you know, on the ground, when folks are saying, oh, this was a priority at this point, do you see substantial shifts annually? Because it sounds like you are overhauling a lot of different indicators and reevaluating them.
Yeah, some are an overhaul, some are a refinement. It sort of varies. But yeah, I would say we see more of a refinement of priorities rather than priorities leaping all over the place and changing a lot. And that is a concern, I know, for Blueprint users. We actually had some specific facilitated discussions around that and corridors specifically at our round of Blueprint workshops in the South Atlantic this past year. So there is a connectivity analysis piece that goes in parts of these Blueprint subregions, but again, it's hard to generalize since they're all sort of different, but that has been in parts, but not necessarily all. We hope to get corridors in the whole 12-state part of the Blueprint next year, but that was a concern with some people who are using the Blueprint, say, for land acquisition. Let's say we hypothetically were to buy a parcel because it was super important for connectivity in the Blueprint. And then all of a sudden that corridor disappears next year and you've built this corridor to nowhere. Corridors are a place where you really feel that it's true for the whole Blueprint, but for corridors specifically, because if you get one patch of good bird habitat, well, that's better than nothing. But if you get part of a corridor, it's not really doing anything for connectivity unless you get the rest of it. And so to try to address that, we did make some adjustments to our corridor approach, where we try to incorporate other information on corridors that have been vetted and used by the conservation community and sort of constrain the corridor analysis so that they're a little bit more consistent over time. And there are some other kind of lessons from exploring that, but that's definitely a message that we've heard loud and clear is we don't want the Blueprint radically changing, but at the same time, the landscape is changing. And in some places it's changing really fast. And so if we don't continue to improve the Blueprint and improve the underlying data, that stuff can get stale quickly. We see that with some of our indicators, habitat cores that the Blueprint's still showing, but there's a Walmart there now. And so it's that tension between, we do need rapid updates to capture the changing landscape on the ground, but we don't want things changing so dramatically that the Blueprint becomes less useful for decision making. And one way that we really try to ground truth that and get comfort level from people is by having Blueprint workshops to review the draft priorities every year. And so we really try to share the word loud and clear and far and wide through our newsletter, through webinars, however we can get the word out. And this will be the first year that we're trying to do a coordinated workshop approach across such a big area. If I had to guess, it will probably be some mix of in-person and virtual. And then of course, there's this pandemic wild card that might influence whether we can safely gather in person, but we will be having workshops. There will be opportunities to review the draft priorities and get opinions from people who live and breathe this stuff every day and know those lands and waters and can say, hey, this is a priority in the Blueprint and it shouldn't be. This isn't a priority in the Blueprint and it should be. You've totally missed this big concept. So that is built in. And sometimes in use cases, I was just working on one the other day with my colleague, Alex. We're working with the city of Sandy Springs in Georgia. And we noticed a corridor that was there last year. It isn't there anymore. And so we're trying to figure out, was this because it was over prioritized in the last version? And this is a course correction. That's a good thing. Is it because it was under prioritized, or have we under prioritized it in the new version? And we need to fix that next year. And so there is a lot of that kind of investigation with on the ground experts and just trying to keep that arc of progress moving for the Blueprint's quality over time.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I have a million questions after that, but we have questions that have come in, so I will ask those instead. So another question that's come in, does the Blueprint have potential to support actions related to climate adaptation, or has it been used for that yet?
Yeah, the Blueprint has been used in some. It was used in a climate adaptation strategy in Florida a few years ago. It's being explored as part of this Pew charitable trust effort on salt marshes regionally. It's been used in the South Atlantic coastal study by the Army Corps. Some states use the blueprint to prioritize important environmental areas that are at risk of inundation due to sea level rise. So definitely people are using the blueprint through that climate change lens. It does include a good bit of data on climate resilience, mostly from the Nature Conservancy. We use their resilient lands data that looks at areas that support biodiversity now and are likely to continue supporting biodiversity even in the face of climate change, either because they're well connected, giving lots of room for species to move, or because they have a wide range of climate niches that tend to track with biodiversity, or both in most cases. So that's the terrestrial piece. And then on the coastal piece, the Nature Conservancy also has a resilient coastal sites data set. It's much more focused on salt marsh and places that are good salt marsh now that have large migration spaces where there aren't barriers like seawalls or interstates that will keep that salt marsh from moving, and a lot of other factors that influence salt marsh health in the face of sea level rise and climate change. So those data sets together are kind of our climate resilience component. And then we think of our corridors as a bit of a climate resilience element as well, because they are identifying these areas for species movement in the face of climate change. Where we've prototyped out those corridors in the South Atlantic in the past, those have tracked pretty well with spanning both coastal and inland areas, allowing for inland migration, and spanning different climate gradients that would allow species to move to find kind of their climate niche as it shifts over time.
That's great. That answered a lot of questions. So that's awesome. Another question that's come in, I know we're running low on time, so I want to get to these. Another question, I saw that conservation of working lands is one of the indicators. How about other conservation of other types of lands other than working lands?
Yeah, so conservation of working lands, I think, is one of the indicators from the Florida blueprint. Other types of lands, and most of the indicators are kind of based on the current condition of the ecosystem and the habitat more than what type of land it is, whether it's protected or whether it's an ag. It's more about what's the patch size and is that enough for birds? What's the water quality and is that enough for fish, sort of concepts. We do include protected lands as hubs in our corridor analysis as some of the places that we're trying to get those corridors to connect, since they're kind of long-term. I might need a little more information on what we mean by other lands to give a more full answer to that question.
Yeah, so yeah, I think working lands encompasses that ag component and that forestry component. But yeah, I agree. I'm trying to think about the urban, you had an urban example and kind of municipality example that it sounds like you're trying to lean into and work towards.
Yeah, that urban, that jogs my memory. That's very helpful. So we do have indicators in the urban environment, and we aren't just excluding all developed areas as not suitable for conservation. And that's where kind of the cultural piece of the blueprint comes in. You know, most of our indicators are ecological, but we are trying to capture, for example, the value of connecting people with nature. And so in urban areas, we do have an urban park size indicator that we expect to go in this 2022 blueprint next year. It's currently being used in the South Atlantic area that you see here in purple. And that's basically just looking at the size of existing urban parks. And we have another indicator that's not necessarily specific to urban, but does include a lot of urban. And it's one that we're very excited about. We hope it will be in the 2022 blueprint Southeast-wide as well. And it's called Equitable Access to Potential Parks. And the idea here is to target areas of park deserts where people don't have access to a park, but there are potential parks there. There are undeveloped lands that we could turn into parks. And if we did that, we would create new park access for people who currently lack it. And that indicator is targeted toward socially vulnerable communities as defined by the CDC. And so what we're really trying to do there is incorporate equity into the blueprint. And that's a place where we have a long way to go. But we also have a greenways and trails indicator that's looking at kind of the connected length of a greenway. How far can I go on my bike or on my jog? And what's my natural experience while I'm on that greenway? Am I like going under the highway through this ugly, poorly lit culvert? Or am I riding past this glorious stream and really getting to connect with nature? So we are trying to get at, to include urban areas and capture that sort of benefits for people part that we talked about with the goal in the blueprint as well.
That's great. Yeah, those are a ton of different data sets that I think are leaning into some of those questions. One other question that's come in, what are the efforts to have comparable data from the different states and species of concern included in the blueprint?
Right. One good example of that is our imperiled aquatic species indicator, which is another one that we should have Southeast-wide in 2022 that we currently just have in the purple, the South Atlantic. That looks at observations of species of greatest conservation need, specifically aquatic SGCNs, by watershed across the geography. And so it's prioritizing watersheds where we know there are a large number of rare aquatic species. And because we're using the aquatic SGCNs, there is that direct link back to state wildlife action plans. We are trying to develop a comparable indicator for terrestrial species of greatest conservation need. And there's some new data coming out from a NatureServe project that we're looking to take advantage of. I'm getting a little out of my technical depth because I don't know a whole lot about this indicator that's just in progress. And I know that we are waiting to see when that source data becomes available before we can really start crunching numbers. But I do think that, yeah, getting those species of concern represented in a consistent way across the geography is something that we're striving toward. And there is room in this new blueprint approach for there to be some still unique indicators for each subregion. So say that we wanted to have an indicator of, I don't know, birds of concern. We wouldn't necessarily, we could reflect the fact that there are different birds in different types of the in different parts of the geography that track with different subregions and try to account for that variability. We're trying to build consistency, but not necessarily paint everything with the same brush because we know that there is a lot of variation.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you so much. I know we are running low on time, so if anyone has any other questions, please submit them in the chat. But Shawn, I just wanted to give you space if you had any last thoughts or questions that you wanted to throw at Hilary.
No questions that Hilary hasn't addressed already. Just a huge thank you, Hilary, for such a great presentation and for spending time with us today, building some shared knowledge. I feel like the work that you guys are doing through SECAS is really helping move the needle, as you said, across the Southeast, but it's also connected to and informing conversations happening throughout the country. And so I really appreciate the chance to connect with you, to hear from you, to amplify this out through the Network for Landscape Conservation so that we can all benefit from some of the shared learning. And the piece that I wanted to emphasize as being so important is the capacity that you guys are continuing to bring towards that ongoing evolution, iteration, improvement, refinement of this tool based on conversation with people. So I see so many tools out there right now that are just, they're sitting on the shelf and not being used because we don't have a way to effectively implement them and improve them to make sure they're meeting user needs. And you guys are actively thinking through not just product development, but product implementation in service to this broader goal. And I think it's just such a great example that I would love to see modeled and expanded throughout the country. So thanks so much for your time. And thanks everyone for joining too. Just really appreciate how busy everyone is. And I know you guys are all doing important work in different parts of the country and really appreciate you spending this hour with us, learning, connecting, and just encourage you to continue to reach out to us as the network to see if we can be a resource for you in the future or to bring other examples forward like SECAS.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, sorry, Hilary, didn't mean to interrupt. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Hilary. Thank you, Shawn, so much. I'm so appreciative of the time today and everybody. So I just wanted to reiterate that this webinar is part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation and Action webinar series. And a recording of this webinar, if you've missed any of it, will be on the network website pretty soon. And then you can continue to access this webinar and past webinars that we've had at our website. And I'm going to drop the link so everyone has that accessible. And then I know Mallory has said that if anyone wants to follow up with him, that's his email, and then Hilary as well. I just also wanted to let folks know that we have an upcoming webinar on Tuesday, November 30th, focusing on legal protections for large landscape conservation. And that is going to be, we're going to have some speakers talking specifically about legislative protections for wildlife corridors from the federal and public land side all the way to the private land side. And as always, I just wanted to say again, a big thank you for all who have attended. We're extremely grateful for that, for your participation in the series and your continued engagement for the Network for Landscape Conservation. And we really hope you have a great rest of your day. So thank you again, Hilary, and thank you so much, Shawn.
Yeah, happy to be here. Good to see you all virtually. Thanks for the help, Shawn. Great to have you chime in.
Sounds good. Thanks all. Bye.